are ready to kick off this panel conversation. So I want to thank everybody for joining us. My name is Belen Gomez. I'm the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives at Equilar. I have the pleasure and the privilege of moderating this panel. You are joining us for the Boardroom Diversity Transformation in Corporate Governance discussion. I have an incredible panel of speakers who I will introduce. But first, I just really want to thank WBC for hosting this event. Thank you, Gwen, her team. This is just incredible to be a part of, so thank you for that. So panelists, I will introduce by name. So we have Camila Thomas, Chief People Officer from Avaya, Public Company Director, also at Mastercraft. Angela Sun, Public Company Director at the Western Union, Cushman and Wakefield, Apollo Portfolio Company, Maxim Crane. Also joined by Singleton McAllister of Counsel at Husch Blackwell, Board of Directors at Alliant Energy, Anterex National Women's History Museum and Chart Industries, as well as Mercedes Romero, Chief Procurement Officer at Primo Water and independent board member at JP Sanfilippo and Marinemax. So thank you all for joining us and taking the time to speak with us this afternoon. I know we have a very short amount of time, about a half hour. We're going to pack a lot in, so let's jump right to it. So as the topic of the panel implies, want to talk about all things boardroom diversity and really start with the data itself. And WBC has done a great job working with us, Equilar, 50-50 Women on Boards, and sort of keeping that constant cadence and drumbeat of data on this in particular, women on boards, and looking at that representation. So 27% of board seats looking at private, S&P 500, Russell 3000, 27% in 21, 22, and in recent years I've sort of seen that pretty static across women representation in board seats. So I want to start there. I want to start with you, Angela and Mercedes, and just get your perspectives on how this constant drip and drumbeat of data is impacting moving the needle for women representation on boards.
Well, I guess I'll start. Belen, thanks so much for convening us. They say that sunlight is the ultimate disinfectant, and there's an analog that data and transparency is the light that exposes inequities. Without reporting and a fact base from which to draw on, there's really just very little impetus for change. And I thought I'd just share a story around kind of my firsthand evidence of this as architect of the Bloomberg Gender Equality Index, which I'm sure you at Equilar are very familiar with. It was 2015 when I was serving on the board of Women's World Banking, a microfinance network, and one of our corporate advisors, Citigroup, lamented that when you look at where companies stand on environmental sustainability, you could look at the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. But if you were curious about where companies stood on women, there was nothing out there to look at. And this was 2015, before ESG became more of a household acronym. So while at Bloomberg, I led the effort to create the first of its kind social index, which measured where companies stand on gender equality. We wanted to look at statistics, so number of women, for example, in the C-suite, women on boards. We wanted to look at policies and practices, not just those affecting women, but also men and women, fertility benefits, maternity, paternity. But we also wanted to kind of jump the divide and look at products and services, moving beyond the workplace, but looking at business metrics. Loan repayment rates between men and women for financial institutions, supply chain decisions. And then finally, we wanted data around legislation. What were companies doing around equal pay? And the thesis was that if we set the standard and we set a bar for inclusion that was high, if we looked at companies that were over $5 billion in market cap, and if those companies, the largest companies, would start reporting their data, then the rest would follow. And I'll tell you that Mike Bloomberg himself was skeptical. He said, how do you know we're going to be successful? I said, I have no idea if we'll be successful, but we'll know very fast. If we have at least 20 people in the index, then that can create a body of information. And I said the second word is investors. This index wasn't a diversity initiative. It wasn't something out of professional development. It was a product. It was an equity screening tool. So when you have investors like PIMCO increasingly focus on these metrics, when the S in ESG was very opaque, if companies didn't report, then they would be screened out. And so the thesis was, if investors care, shareholders care, then boards care. And if boards care, the CEO cares. And even if you don't really believe in it, the sheer fact that you're reporting forces changes in policies. People want their numbers to look good. And if you change your policy, you change your behavior, you change culture, and that eventually changes reality. So I think that's why you see a lot more women on boards today. I think data and reporting has a huge impact.
Yeah. No, I completely agree, Angela, and thanks for highlighting that, because if you think about it, in the end, if we see the U.S. today, 18% of the U.S. population is Latino. And we can see even from the data that we have been seeing that actually the Latino representation and even less the women representation in those boards is significantly lower. So we're really excited and happy to see that in Fortune 1000, we moved from 1.2 to 1.7% of representation in Fortune 1000, which, if you think about it, we are the owners of the spend in our houses. We are the ones that make decisions, and yet those boardrooms need to still start hearing a lot more about us and what we do. So definitely it's a path that we need to bring there, bringing also the thoughts of our shareholders when we're sitting in those boardrooms and making sure that we can provide a better future, not only for our women, but also for our company. So if we're fulfilling our fiduciary duties, we just need to make sure that everyone is represented. So it's just good for business, if you think about it. So it's very true. And now we know how much we were not represented in those boardrooms. And we have to set our target as high as we can.
And Mercedes, I think you said it so well, making sure everyone is represented. And I know really the topic of discussion is women in the boardroom, but we also take a very broad perspective of what diversity in the boardroom looks like. So that is women representation, but that also includes race, ethnicity, that includes LGBTQ, that includes age, that includes skill set. It's such a broad spectrum of how we think about how we populate around the boardroom, that skill set, that expertise that's really going to drive value for a company. And so that leads us to our next question. And Singleton, Camila, I'm going to have you jump in on this. And that sort of multi-part question here is, what are the changes that you're seeing in terms of the makeup of boards 10 years ago versus now? And how critical has it been for the independent directors on the board to really make that push and move the needle in that direction for broader, diverse representation around the table? And what are those skill sets that are newer in the boardroom that perhaps you didn't see 10 years ago?
Well, that's an excellent question. And 10 years is a decade, right? Because traditionally, as we all know, as we talk about women and diverse members around the corporate boardroom, it has traditionally been an old boys network. CEO who knew his other CEO friend, and that's how the boards were typically put together. What we have seen in the last 10, 15, 20 years, a move afoot to get more diversity on boards from a diverse perspective, and also women. And we've also found out that when you do have diverse boards, that the company does do better. As a result, there have been studies that have shown when you have diversity on the boards, your stock can go up. We can talk about ESG, DE&I, all those things that are near and dear to our heart, but we cannot lose face in 2024. There is a chilling effect on the diversity efforts in many fronts. Supreme Court ruled, as you all know, at the university level about DE&I. And others have found ways working with corporations to make sure that you may not call it DE&I, but all the great work that you've done in that regard, you can still maintain it. But let's be real, not everybody is that pro DE&I and ESG, and unfortunately, we're seeing a chilling effect in that regard. I happen to serve as a co-chair of an organization called the Navigators Diversity Program with the ELC, the Executive Leadership Council. And that's an organization that represents African Americans in the C-suite level. And what we've been trying to do is to get more folks on corporate boards. And we have a cohort program every year. And unfortunately, we have seen the chilling effect from those corporations that are looking for diverse candidates, both women and African Americans. So it is real. But we have to be vigilant. We have to be committed. We have to recognize the geopolitical situation that we are all in right now. And this conference is so timely because this is very, very real. And another thing I would say to respond to one of your questions with regard to, as a member of the board of directors, what is our role? We had a program at ELC about taking your power, knowing your power, having courage in the boardroom. And it was very important. Obviously, you don't want to be the only diverse person or woman around the board table talking about those issues. But we've now seen using outside resources to identify those skill sets that you may need. And we're seeing what's happening in the boardroom. You no longer have, you're now instantly putting together terms of years and also age requirements that can open up board seats for diverse members and women, and using those outside resources that are not retooling the same names every time you need a board member that you say no. And as being on Nom and Gov committee, I've been very active in saying, no, don't give me your cookie cutter list that you have. These are the skill sets what we need, and diversity and gender are important to us. And that does have an impact. And I do have members around the board table that obviously agree with me. We've been able to have a phenomenal impact in that regard.
Yeah. I would add to that and echo exactly what you're saying, Singleton, around the role that we play on the board. I also sit on Nom and Gov, and that provides an opportunity to really diversify around those critical skills that are coming about. And the skills that we see emerging in this space are really around like 4 themes. And it's really around the complexity of how businesses are shaping or experiencing in this current state that didn't exist in the last decade. Digital and cybersecurity expertise, right? There is an impressive need around digital strategy, AI, cybersecurity, and managing those risks. We talked about ESG just holistically, and it's not just from a compliance perspective, although it's critically important with all the emergence of data and how we're driving those strategies, but there's just knowledge around those core substances around sustainability, climate, ethics, and how you then apply that from a governance perspective within the organization, not just at the board level. I would say as a human capital professional, the emergence of all these dynamics that have come out of just COVID. You talk about remote work, DEI, culture. So having human capital, cultural expertise at the board level is critical, and just risk and crisis management. And so those kind of are the emerging core skills and competencies you're seeing brought to the board, which in fact allows for broader diversity at the table, right? And so you also hit on a very critical point in the last decade around generational diversity, broadening of backgrounds. And what I also am seeing is that the network effect is changing, right? And to your point that it's not the same people pulling in their colleagues and friends that look like them or may have the same background. There's now a network effect. Once you're in a board, you do see broader pull forward of other women, other aspects of diversity, helping to change the dynamic in the boardroom, and that is a very promising effect that we're seeing in addition to the skills diversity.
And Camila, 2 topics that you brought up are a great segue into the next topic or question, which is ESG and risk. 2 topics that are perennial and sort of dominating in corporate governance discussion. And there was a stat here I want to share with those listening in. So HBR found that firms with a 10% increase in women's representation correlated to a 17.5% increase in the firm's ESG rating. So Camila, what does that tell us? What do you see in that? And then Angela, I want to bring you in as well, and sort of the responsibility of the board to report that data out.
Yeah, I think Angela really hit that point in her introduction around the importance of how data and shedding light on those trends are really having influence on making progress. I think it's also having impact on the ability for making strides in not just shedding a light on where there are gaps around diversity and other ESG metrics and reporting that out, but it's also helping companies do better, right? So it's the opportunity to measure oneself and to report out and have a level of accountability. But I think that also forces organizations, where I see it, is that we're measuring internally. So as a human capital leader, I'm also looking at how we can measure those elements and take action internally that translates to external outcomes, because we are now reporting on those efforts and initiatives. So the reporting, the comparative analysis, the evidence-based driving to these competitive advantages. And I also think it's helping to really create an environment around reputational, enhancing our reputational output as organizations, look at diversity at the board level very differently than they have in the last decade.
I couldn't agree more with everything that Camila just talked about. Having sat on a few public company boards now, I have a greater appreciation that boards are not really the first line in creating reporting, but they obviously are an important influence in setting the tone around reporting, particularly around ESG metrics, right? If the boards didn't take it seriously, management would be less inclined to focus on it. And as Camila talks about human capital and the workplace, increasingly we see that as a metric for individual reviews, right? That wasn't the case certainly a decade ago. And I think one of the things that people often have no sense of in terms of kind of the long history of socially responsible investing, it was actually a term which surprised me that was introduced 50 years ago in 1971. I just turned 50, so I am even more appreciative of kind of the long span and how long it took to get traction. There wasn't broader momentum around socially responsible investing until around 2002. And there was a global reporting initiative then. But still, even then, it took, I would say, a good almost 20 years before we see what we have. I mean, I'm here in New York, the traffic hell that is UN week, but we have the UN to thank for the UN principles of responsible investing. And that was incorporated into the New York Stock Exchange around the mid-2000s. And then you had bodies like SASB, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, which made ESG reporting more like the accounting standards we see for FASB and GAAP. And so it comes back, for me, I always go back to the business side. Like, is it good for business? Because I think you can convince some people around kind of the social imperative. Not everyone's going to buy into it. As Singleton talked about, there is a chilling effect. The Supreme Court case in higher education will certainly have a trickle down impact in the workplace. But this is why you need to internalize it. This is why it's not just about doing a good deed. This is not a charitable, endeavor. It's about business performance, right? And at one point we did work at Bloomberg looking at just how much impact does it have on the bottom line of companies. And we found that a gender-focused strategy actually beat the S&P 500 by 141 basis points, right? So whether you believe it or not, if you are an investor, if you're an issuer, if you're an exchange, these are the statistics that allow them to be kind of increasingly attuned to ESG principles and ESG statistics. And I would just say that, Camila talked about the network effect. I think that the data that's being reported certainly creates a certain type of FOMO, right? If you are a company and you're reporting strong data and you are providing maternity and paternity leave, then you're going to be the company that's potentially going to attract talent and retain talent. And that happens at all ages, not just younger women, but also more senior women who have other choices to make. And so that, when I talk about the index, year one, we had 25 companies disclose. Year two, we doubled it. Year three, we made it sector neutral with 100 companies. And then today I look, I'm no longer at the company, but I looked up the 2023 statistics. There were 620 companies that submitted gender-related data, and about 500 of them met the threshold. And so that is what catalyzes change at the local level, across sectors, across the globe, and how you see change happening in practice at the workplace.
We're going to shift gears a little bit here in our last question and last 10 minutes or so together with our audience. CEOs and how critical they are in this process, this collaboration, and really their participation in helping to move the needle for women representation, not just in the boardroom, but also at the leadership level. So Mercedes Singleton, want to bring you in here. Your experience, any anecdotes that you can share on that successful collaboration, how you've seen that work well, and really getting that support from the CEO and driving that partnership.
Mercedes, you want to kick it off?
Sure. Thank you, Singleton. And I believe that in the end, the way that I see it, I am an operator, and at the same time, I'm also an independent director. So the dynamics are different, however, very similar. Having the proximity of talking with the CEO and making them also see the entire board and our execs, what happens, from a diversity mindset is really important. I could provide us, plenty of examples where just by making them think differently, it helps also reshape the way that we approach the businesses. Now, Camilla, Singleton, Angela, we were all talking about the importance of being intentional, the importance also of participating actively in our nom and gov committees. I am a member of the nom and gov committees in the two companies that I am an independent director now. And I can also tell you that, of course, it's not that they have to listen to us, but definitely by intentionally becoming part of the nom gov, it helps significantly shaping not only the future of the company, but also bringing in the right talent and bringing others that are going to be supporting us. Because in the end, I think that we women, overall, we need to understand that the only way for us to be successful is by bringing in others. So, creating the proper networks, as we said earlier, making sure that we are also supporting our communities, and that we are seeing not only, the ELC is really important. The Asian communities are important, but in the end, let's just help each other so that we can bring our thoughts into that environment. It's extremely key. And again, intentionally making sure that we can support our businesses the right way. Simple examples as, okay, so if you have a network of voters, have you thought about how women see voting? In the end, the decision of who buys a vote, we would think that it's the man. No, it's the woman. So think about it as well when you're making your marketing campaigns and making sure that you're doing it the right way. So we're always there. We are the decision makers.
Yeah, thank you for that, Mercedes. One of the things I would offer is that you may be asked to serve on a nonprofit, a publicly traded or privately held board of directors. One of the things you have to do is do your own due diligence, because they may want you, you may not want them, and as a result, it's about the relationships that you develop on those at the board table. As a board member, the one bit of advice I was giving many years ago, as a board member, it's nose in, hands out. You're not there to manage the company, but you're there to offer advice, counsel, shareholder interests, all the things we're all taught in 101 board dynamics. But it is so important in that regard that you do have a great relationship with management and your CEO, because you're there to help. And as a result, you asking what's the vignettes, I'll give you a couple examples. There's a company called United Rentals. I served on this board for 14 years. They're now the largest in the world that lease construction equipment, et cetera. And as a result, I remember the second meeting I went to, the CEO wanted me to meet with the women directors, district directors. I will never forget it. It was in Baltimore, Maryland, and we went in a big conference room, and I think I could have gotten them all in one phone booth. I said, "You're kidding me. This is all we have." And that was several years ago, but it was intentional. It doesn't happen by osmosis, right? At that time, I was chair of personnel comp, so the issues of diversity were near and dear to my heart. So people were evaluated on their compensation and what are you doing in gender diversity, gender and diversity. So it really got their attention. And I got off the board after 14 years that we imposed term limits. And we had a huge luncheon with the women district directors, and there were over 500. And tears almost came into my eyes. I mean, we really made a difference. And those women were doing phenomenal work. I'm happy to say right now, if you look at the stock, I don't know what it is exactly today, but they closed the other day at over $700 a share. I mean, the company is doing phenomenal. They have that diversity of idea, diversity of perspective. The women are wearing the hard hats. They are kicking butt and doing a phenomenal job. Another example I have is a woman who was the assistant general counsel of another company you could tell she was a real keeper. She was a star, but you could tell that her general counsel, who was a male, was not giving her much exposure. And this particular CEO had asked me to take her under my wing. And I am happy to say this woman is a general counsel of this company. She's doing a phenomenal job. The board loves her. Her staff love her, and that was just a role that I was able to take because the CEO wanted me to take that role, and it was a great result. So those are a couple of vignettes to give us examples of how board members, we have to be active, we have to be persistent, but in a nice way, and obviously work with your fellow board members to make sure that they're on the same page as you are in this journey for diversity in so many regards.
Yeah, and Singleton, if I think about it, I think that it's also really important for us to make sure, as you said, we need to be also intentional on where we want to play and where we're not, where we don't. Because in the end, if you don't have a passion for that specific industry, then your contributions are not going to be as appreciated or as strong as if you did have a passion. We may run into a point where we say, I want this role, no, it has to match your purpose, so that you can fully contribute to that board in the way that it has to be. So,
but I would actually add, Singleton and I both served on boards that were industrials. United Rentals has cross-pollinated quite a bit with Maxim Crane. I actually protested and said, I don't know why you would want me on a crane board. I don't know anything about heavy machinery or large cranes. And sometimes I think people it's good that we're the different person on the board. Singleton and I clearly were among the minority. And someone mentioned age diversity. I think cognitive diversity is as important as the diversity that you can see. The way people think, your political background, the way you grew up, your socioeconomic background, your educational background, all of these things, I think, lend to a better conversation. And particularly, sometimes it happens in industries that you don't even know that you have an affinity for, but your voice is important to give that alternate lens.
And I would add... Yeah, and I would add sometimes from a business outcome perspective, and I had a very similar experience when I joined Mastercraft's board, and they reached out to me, and I said, listen, I didn't grow up on a boat. I didn't have a boat. I am not the demographic, but in fact, I am the demographic because they are looking to broaden their market share for a market that looks like me. And identifies with my experience. And so I think your point, Singleton, was really important around understanding what boards are looking for and how you can meet them where they are. In some cases, you are joining a board, and even if you're joining an organization and partnering with the CEO that needs to take their efforts from here to here. And you know the role you play in that, right? And in terms of helping to get the company from the point that you mentioned when you started to where you were going. And so that's really important in thinking about the contributions you make on both the business level and in an advisory capacity on the board and to the management team.
On that note, I think that concludes our discussion. Before we move off the virtual stage, I just want to thank everybody who listened in, and thank you, of course, to our speakers. Appreciate the time, and WBC. Thank you.